Hi, I'm Brandon Blankenship, and I'm looking at Andrew Pollack's book, Why Meadow Died. I'm looking today at chapter 3, and I'm looking at this book through a restorative leadership lens. Mr. Pollack's daughter tragically died in the Parkland school shooting, and he has attributed that to restorative practices. And so I'm looking at this book really asking the question, is there something that we can do in the restorative leadership model that would address Mr. Pollack's accusations or concerns? And so I said I'm in chapter 3 at this point. And chapter 3 is the first time when we start to get a little bit of insight into what the actual allegation is, and I mean allegation against restorative practices. What is exactly Pollack saying that restorative practices resulted in? Understanding that there's a distinction between restorative leadership, which is the model that we're working on, and restorative practices. But what is the actual accusation? And so it's pretty insightful. This chapter is written by a journalist, Max Eden, who got involved in the case after he saw some of the actions of the school system after the incident. And I think he originally wrote just a basic article about the shooting. And then after he saw some actions of the school system, he took a more active role and decided to actually get involved in that. But there's some things I want to look at just from a restorative leadership perspective. The first thing is the causation. The actual allegation against restorative practices is what the allegation is that if the police would have been called every time the shooter, as a student in the school, if every time the student shooter did something that was considered a crime, if the police had been called and dealt with that student in that situation, then the shooter would have had a criminal record, and the criminal record would have prohibited him from getting a clear ticket or whatever you would call that to actually purchase a gun. And so arrests would have equaled either a pending case or a guilty verdict that would have kept him from being pre-cleared to purchase a weapon, so would have never had a weapon in the first place. So that's the causation allegation. I don't want to stray too far afield from the actual looking at the what the book is saying and how it ties back to potentially benefiting us in an analysis of restorative leadership. But I do think I have to take just a minute and walk through that from a practical perspective. First of all, this shooting happened in Florida. Assuming that the gun would have been purchased in Florida and the shooter would have not driven to some other state to purchase a weapon that didn't have a different law, Florida's law is that someone with a felony or a pending felony cannot purchase a weapon. So that's the first, I think, challenge of this causation chain, is that the allegation or the arrest, if there had been an arrest, if the school had called every time that there was some type of incident with this student, if the school had called every time, then the action would have actually had to been an arrest, and not just an arrest, it would have had to have been a felony arrest. And it would either have been still pending, or it would have had to been ultimately resulting in a guilty conviction for there to have been any impact on the shooter's ability to get a gun. I think that's a bit of a stretch when we look at the altercations or incidents with this student so far. And I'm just in chapter 3, so I don't know what might be coming. But so far, the worst thing that has been described that the shooter committed while he was still a student, and I understand that he was not a student at the time that he was the shooter, but at the time that he was a student, the worst thing that I've read about so far in Pollack's book is that he was involved in a fight. And the fight to me does not seem to be an aggravated fight. In other words, no weapons were used, and there was no other reason to make it something more than a simple battery or misdemeanor. So far, I don't see anything. I don't see anything that that would have resulted in a felony arrest. Again, it's just based on limited knowledge I know from the book. And the author of this chapter did call one of the biggest fight that the student got into a serious one, but he didn't explain why he considered it to be serious. And so, I sort of think, as a journalist, he would have included if there had been a weapon involved or something that might have aggravated it from a simple misdemeanor up to a felony battery or assault. And I don't see that. So let's say even if everything was reported that we're aware of, so far, then I don't see a felony that would have barred a gun purchase. Secondly, the book mentions that there were 23, but somewhere between 23 and 45 incidents that happened that were reported to the police outside of the school activities. So this is stuff that might have happened on the weekends or after school, whatever. So the reports vary, but somewhere between 23 reports and 45 reports to the police about the student prior to the shooting. And so that also makes me question, well, of those 23 to 45 reports, were any of those felony events? And if they were, would that have been a basis for not issuing the license? But these are intelligent people writing this book. And so let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, even if it wasn't causal, maybe it did contribute in some way. And so let's keep reading and see, see what we can glean from the rest of this book. There are some things that are very much more on point with what I'm trying to do with this reading, as opposed to trying to get into a legal causal argument. And that is some things that we learn about the policy of the school and whether or not it might be considered restorative. And so the first thing that I would say is that the school had a policy for particular student incidents to be diverted from a criminal report or let's just say a call to the police department. We don't know if it would have turned into a crime or not. But if a student got into some type of incident, altercation, disagreement, disobedient, whatever, that the school felt the need to call the police department, that they could be diverted into another program, and that program would seek to, quote, have the least punitive means of discipline. Least punitive means of discipline. I would say that is not a restorative practice. And I would certainly say that it would not fall into the restorative leadership model. Our restorative leadership model acknowledges natural consequences, and you don't escape natural consequences. In fact, restorative practices require that natural consequences are dealt with. If you're given an assignment in a school setting, for example, and you don't do the assignment, you don't get the grade. We don't look around and try to figure out and squeeze into some type of awkward, least restrictive grading process. No, there's a natural consequence for not turning in the assignment. What makes restorative practices different is that you're not outed from the community, the school classroom community, and you're not outed from the school community, and you're invited right back into the classroom, provided that you work out your natural consequences. So you've got to resolve the natural consequences, because what we want you to do is stay a part of the community of the classroom. And the same thing would be true in a business setting or anything else. We're not detaching restorative practices from natural consequences in any way. What we're trying to do is we're trying to restore actual justice to the scenario. So, for example, if somebody steals a car and we catch who did it and we put them in prison for 2 years, well, the guy whose car was stolen is still walking. So the natural consequences of spending 2 years in jail did not remedy the injustice. So how do we work out a scenario there where the car is restored and the offender who took the car plays a role in getting the car back to the person that lost their transportation. So in a lot of ways, when you're doing restorative practices, it might look more punitive than a traditional criminal justice process, because where somebody might get, for example, a probation on a crime, that's not going to happen outside of them actually restoring the situation to some type of justice. And so that could look very much more punitive. So that's the first thing that I will just conclude about the school system. Their policies were not restorative in that regard. If that was the objective of the school policy, then restorative practices would not align with that. We're interested in, restored communities, and we can't do that if people who cause harm are not part of restoring the community. The other thing that I thought was interesting is there's a statement in here about who should be in a part of the criminal justice system. And I think that's a difficult question to answer. It really, I guess, goes to the core of the school situation, maybe not necessarily to restorative practices, but I think the real question there is, from a restorative perspective, is there's a process here. When we have someone, I don't know how many incidents there were in the school system yet, but I do know here we have somebody living in a community who's had 23 to 45 calls to the local police. We've got somebody that we're dealing with here, and we need a process of restoring them back to the community. They're not part of the community. They're factious. They're tearing the community apart. They're breaking the community down. They're taxing the resources of the community. So what is going to be the process of that? I'm not convinced that is someone who, quote, should be in the restorative, in the criminal justice system. This very well might be someone who needs to be in a mental health process, or someone who, if they were involved in some type of program where they were able to participate in the natural consequence of their actions, there might not have been up to 45 calls to local police. And I guess just let me stop and talk about that for a minute. Because of something that I actually was able to participate in to some degree. And it was a school that was closed, and a handful of teenage young men broke into the school. In my opinion, it was just sheerly out of boredom, but they broke in and they just wreaked havoc on the school. They broke glass. They spray painted everything they could, well, until the spray paint ran out. They reorganized things, moved things all around the school, uh, broke doors off hinges and just all kind of mayhem. And what they didn't know is that there were video cameras all through the school. And so, their identity was known immediately and they were picked up. And there was a really wise judge in that case. And he said, they brought the young men in and he said, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to that school at 8:30 every morning, and you're going to meet with a maintenance man, and you're going to fix everything you broke, and you're going to scrape off and repair any paint that you painted. You're going to replace the glass. You're going to, mop the floors. When you leave that place, it's going to look brand spanking new. And so they did. They went back to the school. They went, I think it was over a period of 3 weeks. They showed up every morning. They worked every day. And when it was all said and done, the school was restored. The judge brought them back in and said, okay, this was your shot. You don't have a criminal record. I don't ever want to see you again. There are natural consequences for what you do, and you did wrong. You made it right. Don't put yourself back in that position. Okay, that's suffering the natural consequences. It was probably harsher than it would have been if they had actually gone through the criminal justice system. I think, without exception, those young men got the point, and I don't suspect we'll see them again. In fact, I think they'll probably grow up and be great citizens that you'd want as your neighbor. So I'm going to get off my soapbox about that. All right. The next thing that I want to distinguish with restorative practices, restorative leadership. In our restorative leadership model, we have a practice called connecting candor, or connected candor. And the point about that is that we have to just tell the truth, no matter how bad it is, no matter how ugly it is. Sometimes even no matter how much it might hurt somebody, we've just got to tell the truth. We've got to have candor inside our community. If I say something and it offends you, then you got to tell me. And if you say something that offends me, then I got to tell you. If you do something that hurts me in some way, I've got to communicate that. And the same thing I expect of the leader, I expect of the follower. I expect the follower to have candor with me, and the follower expects the same from the leader. So what is pretty clear, if we take this journalist position as truth, and I have no reason not to, what's pretty clear is the school system immediately went into risk mitigation mode. They hustled up and they got together and they started doing everything they could do, to minimize risk. And so part of that was controlling information. What information got out, and who knew what, and just dribbling out information that was absolutely necessary. This is the exact opposite of restorative leadership. If we're looking to our stakeholders to participate with us in an answer to how we're going to achieve an objective, if we are listening to our stakeholders, genuinely listening, empathetically listening, for them to tell us what we've got to do to solve a problem, remedy a wrong, then the only way the stakeholders can do that is if they have the information, the true, full, whole truth of the situation. And that doesn't seem to be what happened here at all. What it seems like happened was that the school system went to work wordsmithing and making public relations moves, as opposed to getting authentic information out to people that were stakeholders in this, and that's a pretty broad picture. Now, I will stop and say there are certainly privacy concerns that we have to be aware of. We certainly have children involved here, and there are certain privacy considerations. We would want to engage anybody who was injured in this process, or their parents, and what information could be released as far as publicly was concerned. But there's absolutely no reason why the parents would not be fully informed. The students would not be fully informed. And there are ways to navigate that privacy concern without playing hide the ball with the information. Restorative leadership absolutely requires candor. And anybody who's sitting on information is not participating in a restorative leadership environment. It's just a necessary piece of it. All right, let's see if I missed anything else for chapter 3. Nope, I think that's it. So thank you for hanging out with me on this chapter 3 review, and we'll be moving on to chapter 4 next week.